The self. What is the self? It's a concept that generally is related to human beings, but it has many characteristics, some of which are present also in animals which are older phylogenetically than Homo sapiens. What are the characteristics that are part of the concept of self? There must be a self-generating activity, because the self is independent from the sensory inputs. In reflexes, motor action is triggered by a sensory stimulus, which through a reflex arc is connected to motor neurons. But as long as the development of the nervous system went on during evolution, some independence of the motor activity developed, which can be considered already part of the concept of the self. So there must be a self-generation of activity, and in the motor system there are many centers in different structures belonging to the motor system which have an activity which is self-generated. Another requirement of the self is that it must have continuity. The activity must be permanent, because the self is controlling the life of the individual. And apart from the period of sleep, which is present in all animals, during the awake state, the self must be ready to respond to sensory inputs and take decisions. And decision is another aspect that is part of the self. Every animal must take decisions. Even a set of reflexes can take decisions. For instance, when resolving conflicts between alternative responses, which is in contrast with each other. Even a set of reflexes can resolve this kind of conflicts, simple ones. As long as we go up in the complexity which evolved in the nervous system, the ability to take decisions benefited from the functions that developed. And in human beings, it's the cerebral cortex, which is the most complex structure that allows human beings to take decisions which are the result of reasoning, evaluation, much more complex than lower structures. For instance, the limbic system, which is based on emotions, take decisions on the basis of impulses. And this happens in human beings as well. That's why we need to have a balance between impulses and the rationality given by the cerebral cortex. Another aspect of the self is will, to perform voluntary actions. We decide to do something independently of anything happening in the environment. So it's not a reaction to something happening in the environment, but it's a decision, a voluntary decision to do something. Going back to the example of the limbic system, emotions are not as automatic as reflexes, but they are very strong tendency to trigger a motor action in response to a sensory input. A voluntary action can be a movement, something we do, but also a mental action. So the self is also able to decide what to think about, what to do, with the ability it has to perform actions at mental level. So voluntary action means motor action or a mental action. In the concept of self also, there must be the ability to direct attention towards something in the environment. And this is another aspect that many animals have, not only human beings. But of course, in human beings, there is a very sophisticated system to consider different aspects of reality. Another function of the self, and with this we start going up in the evolutionary scale, because it's the ability to retrieve personal memories. And it's a very important step in defining a self that is able to have memories and to retrieve memories starts resembling the self we consider typical of human beings. And this step was possible because a complex structure evolved, the hippocampus, which is able to store memories of our experiences in life. So it's quite an extraordinary function that some kind of organization of neurons and their connection can perform. The appearance of the hippocampus is an important step in the definition of the self, able to have a past life and go back to past life, to remember or to use the memory to face situations which are part of daily life. Another aspect of the self is that it must receive sensory information, because it must consider what to do on the basis of the sensory input which is coming from the environment. And this, again, is a function which is a much more complex function than just a response to stimuli in the environment that trigger reflexes. The information that the self must receive is the highest level of the sensory processing. For instance, when we see something in the environment, our visual system analyzes the visual input, processes it, and activates some representations of what we see. These representations are the final part of the route that from the occipital lobe reaches the inferior temporal lobe, where these representations are located. And these representations are connected to other structures of the brain to provide high-level information about what's happening in the environment from the visual point of view. So that's the kind of information which is useful to the self to decide what behavior to take. Another characteristic of the self, especially in human beings, is that it is able to browse other cortical areas. Because of the structure of the human brain, and especially of the human neocortex, the self is an operating center that is able to browse other parts of the cortex, and especially the ones located in the upper layers of the cerebral cortex. Another aspect of the self is that it needs to have a temporary storage for data to perform its actions, and this is called working memory. Sometimes working memory is identified with the self, but it is not the same thing, because working memory is a memory. It's a temporary memory that is used for some purpose, and of course it's different from the memory of past experiences that we can retrieve from the structures which are responsible for it. So the working memory is a temporary storage of data necessary to perform some actions, mental actions, motor actions. And the self can remember, for instance, a telephone number while we go to the telephone after having read it on our telephone book. Keeps data available for a short time. The self must be able to use images that are contained in our brain and also to imagine something. So it's another function which the self can do. The self does it voluntarily, because some other spontaneous images may appear because other areas of the cerebral cortex are activated. The same is true for memory. Voluntary retrieve of memory is an action of the self. Sometimes there can be spontaneous memory which appear to us because the system of memory for personal experiences in life works like this. Another function of the self is to plan for the future, to have an idea of what to do and envisage a plan of action. And this is another function of the self. So the self is a concept which includes a number of functions, some of which are present already in animals which are much older than us in the phylogenetic history of life and of the nervous system. And some other parts of the self are typical of the human self. And this human self relies on the upper level of the six-layer cortex that keeps in communication cortical areas, high-level sensory areas, associative areas, semantic knowledge. So the self relies on the ability to browse all these cortical areas whenever it's necessary, or even without any particular purpose. The act of thinking, it's part of the self, it's part of the mental activities which are controlled by the self, this operating center, which is probably located in the frontal lobe, and it's responsible also for mental activities. So it is very important concept, that of self, and the human self is able to perform the complex actions that we can perform. So this is a definition which is rather neurophysiological than psychoanalytical, because the self in psychoanalysis is part of the psychoanalytic theory, and in some way it resembles the neurophysiological self, but doesn't correspond to it. The neurophysiological self is an operating center that controls the activity of the brain, especially the mental functions that we are able to carry out.